Subjectivity and narratives. This is the first, I want to say, lecture from the last module. It has to do with beauty. Now, it seems a little odd, perhaps, maybe to end the whole course on beauty, but especially because we think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So we're going to talk about that on Wednesday and Friday. So I'm going to think a little bit about exactly how beauty fits into something universal, or is it just something that we agree with? And that has to only do with our own person. And also, I want you to start too thinking about how, like, what is beauty per se? I mean, it's one thing to say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but that's one of those ideas like, truth and love and goodness. And when you ask somebody, like, you define beauty, it gets a little more difficult. So we'll get into that a little bit later. The whole idea here is to try to find a way in this course that we've always been connecting peace to justice. So where we can reduce injustices, we can increase peace. And where we find peace, it's usually because we have a sense of justice being performed in our lives on various levels. So you could think of this in terms of, racial justice, sexuality justice, feminist justice, just go down the line, economic justice, all of those particular things. And we have to try to find a way that, we can't overthrow an entire system. We can't change the world. That was part of us introducing, Augustine's two cities, is that there's never going to be a perfect justice here on this earth. And from a Christian standpoint, we don't then leave it at that, saying, well, if there's nothing we can do, then why try? So how do we achieve justice, bring peace through justice, even in our own fallen state? And that becomes a little bit more difficult to try to determine. And what I want to look at today is what are some of the factors that I would say are obstacles to that. Even interpersonally, oftentimes things just go awry and we're not quite sure what happened. You ever had a situation like that with a friend? Things just, drifted apart. Something was said. It wasn't said in the way that you wanted to say it, or they didn't hear it in a way that you meant it. And before you knew it, the two of you weren't in the same type of relationship that you were, days before, months before, or a year before. And you're not quite sure how it happened. You're not quite sure how to get past that and bring it back to a sense of, well, we call it justice there, but just for a sense of connectivity between the two people. So that's part of what we're going to talk about here. Now, when I use the word narratives and such, I do mean story, but I don't just mean like, once upon a time story. This is a little more similar to what the mythos would have been from a Christian standpoint. So when we talked about the Genesis account, and I was trying to make the claim that what we get from that is who we are as a people. So being made in God's image, how God did everything orderly, how the human person was the pinnacle of creation, how the human person was in relation to God and also in relation to others and creation, that all then forms who we are as a people in relation to our God. And it becomes our story. And I tried to show a contradiction between that and say the Enuma Elish, where things were more haphazard, there was a lack of order, the human person was an afterthought, and when they were created to be slaves to the God. And I meant to really point out that that's not the story we would like. So what we are to do then as Christians is to view our entire life through that ethos. Now, we have other stories that also form as narratives. And those things are important because it could be the way that you grew up. It could be the ethnicity or the race that you come from. It could be the economic status that you have. A lot of things that happen in our lives that have formed who we are as people, and they become our story. We could almost think of if we were to write our own autobiography, what would we write? So these are powerful and they determine our meaning, but we just have to be careful that they don't become closed-in narratives. And that's where I'm going to be going with a lot of this. Because what happens is our stories can really press themselves into our identities. When they do that, in other words, it's one thing to identify with a particular group that we belong to. It's another thing to only see the world through the lens of that particular group. There's something that's going to be amiss there. So we're going to have to ask them hard questions about how is it that all these ideas in the world, and justice is an idea, equality is an idea, goodness is an idea, Liberty's an idea. All of these things are going to be looked at through the lens of our narrow group if we're not careful. So what I don't want you to think is that we have to find, as I talk about the conversations that we need to have between these groups and how we have to, form narratives together. I don't want you to think that this is the lowest common denominator type of compromise. It's not that two groups should come together and just find what they have in common and then accept only that. That's a bad idea, and actually it's farther away from the truth, even on a very basic level. Think about if you and your boyfriend, girlfriend were going out to eat and pretend you like different things, right? You like Chinese and he likes Italian. Well, if he doesn't like Chinese, he's not going to like your idea, and if you don't like Italian, you're not going to like his idea. So you might say, let's compromise. Well, we'll go and get, I don't know, we'll go and get Pennsylvania Dutch food. Well, maybe nobody likes that. So the compromise is, oftentimes misunderstood as the middle ground. It's not what a compromise is. What I'm talking about here is that we find a way to have a common discussion between things and grow in a level of respect for each other. And that can be done while you still hold your own perspectives. So we're going to finish this course talking about how Republicans and Democrats could have discussions amongst each other. The goal is not for the Democrat to lose their identity and think like a Republican does. The goal would not be for a Republican to lose what they value and to think like a Democrat. There has to be some other way to do this. So the compromise is not just to find the things between the two and then go for that. But we're going to have to find a different way to approach some of these things that are going to allow us to have conversations. And the entire goal here, remember, is that we can form a justice for each other, even if we still differ. And then from that justice, live in peace. We'll talk more about this as we move on. Okay. Now, here's the problem. If we only had our own subjective experience, how I see the world. Now, that's important to me. But what happens is that I have a hard time having any sort of substantial contribution to people that are outside of my group, and I'm going to have a hard time really having, let's even say, a meaningful conversation with somebody outside of the group, because they're going to disagree with me. I'm going to have a hard time trying to have a conversation about something that perhaps they think is in error. So what you see going on in our world today, and this isn't unique, our political division is not something that's just occurred now. Anybody that does any historical, survey of presidential elections and administrations will find that this goes back right to the beginning. But the problem is that we get used to not talking to people outside of our group, and we only get used to talking about to those people within our groups. And that's a self-affirming equation. In other words, when you wrote your essays, and the comments that I was making on them was never meant to be personal, like, well, you should have, done this, or the reader would argue against this. It's almost as if that you're not trying per se to change the other person, their opinion of your whatever it is the topic you're talking about. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get them to understand your position well. That requires a different approach. If we never talk with groups that are outside of ourselves, it's easy for us to become very tribal, and you see that now. We've kind of lost the means to do this, but I mean, it's social media, just with the idea of a hashtag, right? I know that I don't know anything about Twitter, but I realize hashtag in front of some sort of keyword, and anybody else's keyword will also find whatever it is that you're speaking about, and then perhaps you can share your points of view. But the problem is that right off the bat creates a closed-ended narrative. We're not looking for things we disagree with. We're looking for people that we agree with. So we wind up in some of our own psychological, we're going to call it like an echo chamber, where we can basically just affirm each other's egos. Now, that might psychologically give us some sort of satisfaction, but it's only going to increase our own subjective perspectives. And the problem is that and here's where we're going with this, so you don't think it's just a cultural critique. If we want justice, whatever it is that we think is the necessary injustice that needs to be overturned, and we do that through the lens of our own particular subjective experience, then how are we going to have a conversation with somebody outside to try to make them aware of what our injustice is? We have broken down the means to have any sort of meaningful communication. best that we can do, as we'll see, is shout the other person down. Find some way to overcome them. That's the article's point. It's the tyranny of the subjective. There's no other way to really engage in meaningful conversation except to find ways to belittle and reduce the other person down, make them cower to the point where, they, if whether they agree or not, they at least succumb to your argument. Now, we'll get back to that. But we have to find some sort of a objective perspective where we are basing what we associate as far as information and also in our narratives. It's based on something that's verifiable. Like, here's an easy way to understand this. Memes have a certain, we'll talk about slogans in a minute. Memes have a certain appeal in social media because we tend to think that they say something in a sarcastic or comical way that makes our particular point. And oftentimes they'll have quotes in them, right? So, we'll quote George Orwell. I'm thinking of one that was an English teacher that I was friends with. She put up this meme about something that George Orwell had said. And I read enough literature that I may not remember everything, but I know whether or not it sounds right. And right off the bat, especially with George Orwell, I know most of everything he's written and read it 5 times. And I'm thinking to myself, he never said that. So I double checked my book because I write up and down my book, and he never even got close to saying that. So I said something to that English teacher, and I said, George Orwell didn't quote what you just said he quoted. He goes, well, okay, but isn't it still a really good quote? I said, it's a meaningful quote. When you put it next to a particular name that has a literary reference like that, you're trying to give it an authoritative ring. And that's not an accurate way to really go into a conversation. Okay, now that might seem meaningful. You might even think it's kind of, picky. My philosophical background in teaching logic has almost forced me into, and again, you're probably going to get a kick out of this, I will not share a meme unless I usually make it myself, and I usually put the citation at the bottom of it because I want people to know I'm not making this up. If it's a meaningful thing that's been said by G.K. Chesterton, by Orwell, by Dostoevsky, the person should at least know where to go and find that particular thing so they can get it into context. Let me give you a really good example. Somebody just shared this meme the other day, and it had 3 different, I'm going to call it panels on this meme. And it was to mock Republicans, or conservatives. And again, you could agree with some of these things. I did agree with some of these, but that wasn't the point. The first one had an officer wrestling down a black person, and it was supposed to show police brutality. And underneath it said, you need to follow the law. The second meme showed what was presumably immigrants within a chain link, enclosure, and it said underneath, you need to follow the law. And then the third one was all of these so-called conservatives that were lined up in our COVID-19 because of the shutdown, and they want things to be reopened. It showed them all protesting, and it said they follow the law, but only when it affects themselves. Okay, so I thought to myself, what are they trying to get across? They're trying to show that a person holds a particular position changes it when whatever it is they think becomes an inconvenience affects them. Now, whether I agree or not with some of the incidents that they put in those panels, I thought this is about as bad as an argument gets. Because if somebody hired me, as a lawyer to fight for that particular person's point of view, I would say the one common theme between all 3 of those things is that person has a particular interpretation of constitutional law, and it works perfectly in each one of those scenes. So what I thought was, who would agree with this then? The person who would agree with this is the person who already has some sort of disdain for conservatism. They would immediately just accept it uncritically because it resonates within their own echo chamber. It's just based on feelings and emotions. Even if there's something that's true within it, that's not the point. And even if I would agree overall with what they're trying to say, that's also not the point. But the point of it is that breaks down conversation, and it becomes tyrannical, right? So in other words, it gets to the point where the only way to beat the other person, well, let me say this, the only way to get the other person to accept the type of justice that you're looking for is to browbeat them. It would be different for us to engage something where we had to verify the information and the facts. Think of how much time it took for you to write your paper. And think of how much more you could have possibly have said. Could you imagine if everybody put that type of effort into something they shared on social media? Now, that might sound silly off the bat to you, but what would it solve? It would solve a lot of the errors that go around, just things being passed around that either in fact aren't true in themselves, or they don't make quite sense, or they don't make good sense, right? So it's a way for us to try to get out of our own stories and not to dismiss those things that form us who we are as people, but to allow it to be informed by other people, and allow them to enter into our narrative so that hopefully we can see if somehow we may not have things entirely right, which in the end, we'll see that that's part of the goal. There's nothing better in academia, even from a professor's point of view, to be corrected when you're wrong. It might bruise your ego a little bit, but it informs you and it doesn't allow you to continue that error. So the goal should be never to make an error, but the goal should be not to ever make an error, but the goal should be never to make an error twice. That's education, okay? So part of what happens is that think of how many things in social media, and even you forget about social media, think about presidential campaigns. How many times have slogans been used to try to convince somebody of either the credulity of your own position or the error in their own? And I've already shared with you how I do not like slogans, and this is zero to do with what those things stand for. I don't like the slogan pro-life. I don't like the slogan pro-choice. I don't like the slogan love is love. I don't like the slogan all time. I don't care. Pick it, and I don't like it because it doesn't always really say what you think it means. Let's go back to some presidential slogans. If somebody says, make America great again, is there a person out there that does not want America to be great? Whatever that is. If somebody says, I'm for hope, which a presidential candidate did, is there somebody out there that says, I'm for despair? The problem with slogans is that they only resonate within our own narrative, because they are so vague by nature. That's what a slogan is. A slogan has to be so broad that it can capture many different people and bring them to your side. But the problem is that we adhere to these slogans, never really quite knowing what they mean. So we adapt them to our own narrative, and you can get two people in the, in the same, they would say underneath the same slogan's banner, who don't necessarily agree, but it seems like they do. Now, when slogans are used to achieve justice, you can see the problem here. The problem is it's going to only give us a semblance of coming together. Really nothing meaningful there. It doesn't mean slogans are bad. Slogans are only bad when they're used for arguments. There's nothing wrong with using a slogan to try to make a point. It's using the slogan to pretend that it concludes your argument. So these things become very, how do you want to say, problematic for us to have discussions. And I think they actually push us even farther into our subjective perspectives. It's nothing unique to me. It's something that, many people say. So what the article then talked about with this audio ultimate partitum, right? So it literally means to listen to the other side. It has a deeper meaning than that. We live in this age where it gets difficult for us, let's say this way, it's uncomfortable for us to live and listen to those things, right? It's a good practice for all of us to spend some time every day reading or looking up things that 100% against what we would conceive to be part of our story. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with them. It just means that we have to consider those things. And that's what this listening to the other side is really based on. It's based on respect. It doesn't matter how off that person is, according to your or mine particular points of view, but they're human beings and they deserve to be listened to. You don't have to sit there for the whole time. You don't have to take things on the chin. But we have to make sure that we're not ourselves and just interpreting all reality through an emotional stance. That's not a way for us to achieve some sort of sense of justice. If we're going to keep the claim that peace in this world comes from justice, we have to figure out what's the best way for us to achieve justice. If you're going to do this by just trying to cower the other person into submission, then you're going to have to accept that there might be a time when they get enough power or enough people that they will return the favor and then cower it back into submission. So we can't just have the big person on the block always winning. There has to be some other interpretation for us to move through our stories to help each other. So we have to get past this idea that simply listening to the other side means that we agree with them. Let's go back to scripture. When Jesus Christ would spend time with those on the outside, quote unquote, he scandalized the religious leaders. So we read, for those of us that are Christian, we read some of this in the Easter Passion, that who is this man that claims to be of God and he spends times with tax collectors and prostitutes? So my point is that as Christ and as Christian, he scandalized others by who he associated with. We still think that way, right? And we don't just think that way in religion, we think that way in our culture. We think that if somebody finds out that I'm in conversation or spending time with people who perhaps think against my particular feelings on race, my particular feelings on sexuality, my particular feelings on religious beliefs, and people are going to associate me with that group, and therefore I should make sure that I stay away from that. You know, we have a different type of scandal going on today. We have a scandal of people not associating with those we disagree with. And this is very true even for like within Christianity. When was the last time priests and ministers? I mean, think of who's on the outside today. You know, issues of sexuality and gender. When was the last time you saw bishops and priests spending time with those individuals? They would be fearful, maybe not personally, but they'd be fearful that they don't cause scandal, that others see them with them, and all of a sudden now they're going to think that I totally agree with this or that person. But it was the exact opposite in scriptures. The scandal came from not associating with those. Today they come from, well, the scandal was that they were associating. That was good. Today the scandal is they're not associating, and that's not good. So we have to get over this idea that just listening to another person's point of view, and not just listening, right, but trying our best to understand it. So I made a point earlier that we should stay away from the straw man argument. You should not come up, and this was a problem if anybody wrote in their essays. Don't find the weakest argument of what you are opposed to and then dismantle that. That's easy, like knocking down a straw man. You got to do the steel man. What is the best argument for that which is opposite of yours? And then you argue against that. That's an entirely different approach. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot more effort. And there's a risk involved because you might actually find that it makes some sense. And then you're going to have to concede that, right? But we'll talk more about that later. So that brings us up to like, what should we be our goals when we're in discussion? Our goal should not be to win. That might sound odd, but our goal should only be to understand. In other words, well, let me put it even more clearly. Our goal should be truth. In other words, it should be two people. And again, think in terms of religion, think in terms of race, think in terms of sexuality, think in terms of nationalities, think in terms of politics. Could you imagine if two political candidates, okay, so we're going to see debates in the fall between Trump and Biden. Could you imagine if both of them stopped trying to just dig their heels in and said, how can we solve the immigration debate? In other words, I know this will never happen. Could you imagine if two candidates said, what could we do? How could we do this? It would be a disaster for each political party because everybody who's on their political tribes would just rise up. So when, you know what, we can't worry about the world. We can only really worry about ourselves, which has been an overarching point of this whole course. It isn't that you shouldn't try to change systems that are unjust and in error, that we really can only be responsible for who we are as individuals. There's an old adage that if you want to change the world, love the people closest to you. When I teach marriage prep, I always tell them that if you really want to have a revolution, then love the person that you're marrying deeply, have children, be faithful, raise them, and celebrate 60 years of marriage. If everybody in a room, if I had 50 couples in a room and if all did that, that'd be a little mini revolution. But it sounds daunting. It actually sounds very difficult, sounds a little idealistic, and it sounds like it's a lot of hard work. But that's the difference, right? I mean, rather than complaining about something, why can't we just try to live differently? The very beginning of that would be to listen to the other side and have truth as a goal and not to browbeat the other individual. This next point on internalized idea, here's the issue. So the end that I grew up in was a very poor end, different ethnicities, and probably like 5 or 6 ethnicities and race, and we all had our own clubs. But we also all got along together because we were celebrating our diversities, but we were also very respectful of each other's. So what you try to do is that when a person has a very subjective perspective, and when whatever it is they're holding, again, this could be in terms of sexuality, this could be in terms of marriage, it could be in terms of political affiliation, religious, it doesn't matter what you're speaking about. What happens is that we become very emotionally invested in those particular positions and we internalize them. So the minute that somebody starts, at least we perceive them to start attacking a particular position we hold, we can only associate that with them attacking us. We no longer can differentiate between the positions we hold and who we are as individuals. So if a person is a Republican and they identify so tightly with the Republican Party, the minute somebody starts attacking a Republican or conservative position, that individual is going to think that they're attacking them. That's part of the problem that we have. We can't disassociate ourselves from these positions that we hold. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be important to us. That doesn't mean they shouldn't even be part of our narratives. What it means is they can't be the sole lens through our narrative. That's the idea. So what in the end we should be doing is understanding the nuances of our own position and understanding the nuances of the person's position. It's a matter of respect. So we're going to end this course in the next, next week, looking at the discussions between New England liberals and Kentucky conservatives, who did nothing else but enter into a conversation. And most of their friends, especially the conservatives, felt like their friends were saying, you're being set up. Well, neither of them, you want to call the sides, neither of them changed their positions. The Kentuckys remained conservative and the liberals in New England remained liberal. What they did notice is that they started to care for each other because they recognized their shared humanity. And they no longer saw the other person as stupid. So the individuals in New England no longer saw the Kentucky individuals who, had coal mining in their as a microeconomy, no longer saw that as their disregard for the planet. They saw it from their perspective. That changes not particularly what positions we hold are, but it changes our understanding of the other individual. So if we cannot internalize our own particular positions, therefore any attack on a position is not an attack on us, but also if we can have a nuanced discussion, then the whole thing changes. And the reason why I'm not very fond of crowd mentalities is that they tend to break down reason. This doesn't mean that I'm opposed to demonstrations or protests. I think those are important aspects of civil disobedience. What I mean is you can get caught up in the moment, and getting caught up in the moment tends to start, how do you want to say, it tends to start articulating things in a very unreasonable fashion. Well, let me put it this way, it doesn't articulate things whatsoever. What happens is we have to find some way to alleviate the particular guilt that we have for whatever it is that brought us to this point of outrage. So the article, if I remember right, makes this concept of moral outrage being our psychological sense where we're trying to alleviate our own guilt by standing up for something. Let me be very specific, and I'm not trying to point to anybody particularly. I have hardly met a young person who doesn't think that we are in a climate. They might disagree with how we got here. They might even disagree with how much humans contribute. But 15, 20 years ago, I would have fought as a professor to try to get students to understand the importance of taking care of the environment and how we're related to it, and in particular in forms of justice. Today, I haven't met a student in the last couple of years that hasn't already accepted this as they entered school. But what I have found is that it doesn't really change a lot of person's personal behavior. So you still see people flying away to, vacations and spring break. It's not going to change the way that we live and then we drive. In other words, it's almost as if we're finding ways to alleviate our own guilt. We see a sense in this, but we don't know exactly how to handle it. So if we have a certain level of moral outrage, it sort of alleviates our own particular psychological concern for our lack of participation in that. And this happens across the board. None of us are immune from this. You can think of this in recycling, right? Somebody might think just because they recycle that perhaps they're doing something. You see individuals on social media, because they're posting things, for some reason they think, and this idea of like woke culture, right? The fact that they're posting something makes them feel that they're actually doing something when they're not. You're just posting a meme and sharing it. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything to help alleviate the issue that you're particularly, say, championing, right? So this would not happen if we didn't have some sort of connection emotionally to these things. If we were looking at these things more objectively through information and accuracy, we would almost be ashamed in a sense that it's almost like, could you imagine somebody who would be totally against racial prejudice and went out and told racist jokes? They would almost at some point come up with their own cognitive dissonance, like there's something I'm not doing right. And there's nothing worse, they say, than an ex-smoker trying to tell other people that they should quit, because you're trying to make up for the fact that you were weak for many years and you yourself smoked, but now you know that it's wrong, so you're going to be the champion for it. Well, these things might psychologically seem to, make sense for us, but they're based on our own subjective perspectives that are not going to really help us listening to the other side. I'll leave it there. So what we have today, and this is a good quote from the article: veracity is the truth or the level of the argument, if you want to say. The veracity of an argument depends less now on verifiable information and facts, more on the level of outrage formed through opinions and feelings that resonate with our closed-ended narratives, hence the tyranny of the subjective. So it's almost as if like the only way for us to then bring peace through justice is to force our particular narratives on somebody else, because we've lost the ability to have that inner communication. That's an issue. And it's a very, deep issue, one that we don't consider. So the difference between a dialectic and a debate is a debate is two people, digging their feet in. Maybe there's a point to this. I'm just not a big fan of debates. Even when I taught high school, I was not interested whatsoever in being part of the debate club, because people put their feet in, they dig it in, and all they try to do is chisel the other person down. And when they say somebody wins a debate, I'm never quite sure what that means. For a person who teaches logic, I'm telling you, the way you win or lose a debate is by the validity of the argument, not by exactly who thinks what. Like, for instance, here would be a good example. This fall, I don't care what your political positions are. This fall, when Biden and Trump are debating, if you're a Republican and you're supporting Trump, after the debate, turn on MSNBC and listen to the commentary for the debate. Force yourself to do that. You're going to wonder, did they watch the same debate that you just watched? If you are a diehard liberal and you cannot stand Trump, after the debate, turn on one of the Fox, stations, one of the, the commentaries by Hannity or such, and listen to what they say about who won the debate. You're going to think the same thing. They watched the same debate I did. What we have here is we have people that are enclosed in narratives. So who won a debate is determined by how many people say somebody won. That's not how it works. Who won a debate was by the veracity of the argument. The veracity of the argument depends on the validity of what you said and the truth of your premises. So that's my problem with debate. Dialectic's an entirely different thing. Dialectic requires interaction. And there's nothing. The last thing anybody does in dialectic is shut the other person down. That's the last thing you want to happen. All you're going to be doing is going to ask question after question after question, trying to make sure that you understand that individual clearly. And you're not going to even bother commenting until you know you understand the individual. Now, this is not a technique to win an argument, but sitting right where I'm at now, my daughter, who's in her mid-late 20s now, when she was a member of ninth grade, she came down and she goes, "Hey, I want you to teach me how to use logic and how to do argumentation." So I said, fine. So she sat right across from me. So I'll be looking at her like I'm looking into the camera now. And I said, here's what you do. I said, listen to what a person says, ask enough questions that you make sure you understand it correctly. And then find out if what they say makes sense. If what they say makes sense and it goes against what you believe, then you need to adapt that position to yours. You need to tell them, thank you for enlightening you. If it goes against what you believe and you find errors in their argument, find what the foundational error is. And then in a non-confrontational way, ask it in a really precise question and then stop speaking. What you're going to normally find, and this is not the goal, but it's what happens, is the other person becomes tongue-tied. They realize that in one sentence, you've undermined their entire thing. But the goal there wasn't to win the argument. The goal was to try to get a truth between the two. Could you imagine Donald Trump saying to Joe Biden, that's a really good point. I haven't considered it like that. And I think I've changed my mind. Could you imagine Joe Biden saying to Donald Trump, I know that people really come at you on this. I've agreed with you all along. Could you imagine those two people saying something like that? It's almost hard for us to imagine because we know what the outcome would be. Because in a debate, you need to win. In dialectic, all you're interested in is the truth that perhaps two of you can come to together. So what we have to do as human people, because this can't happen on a systematic level. You're not going to put some law into place that's going to change this throughout a nation. What we have to do is just figure out how do we do this ourselves, because we're only responsible for what we do in the world, not for what others do. We're responsible for how we listen. We're responsible for how we act. We're also responsible for how we enter into discussions. So what values can we develop within our own particular lives that are going to enable us to coexist with the person next to us? That has nothing to do with compromise. This isn't the lowest common denominator. I told you before, that's tragic. What it's trying to do is like, look, even if we disagree, is there a way that we can still move forward on this? Is there something that's going to at least allow us to both hold our positions in respect? And there is. But we have to get past what is basically known as hashtag justice. The minute that you put a hashtag on something, again, you're only looking for people that are already going to agree with whatever, terms that you're putting out there, your keywords. It's not a good way for us to enter into conversation. It's hardly ever going to get us to look for the objective perspectives, which means that perhaps social media is not a viable way to do this. And I think that I've tried to do a couple things over the course of the last 10 years on social media, and you learn pretty quickly that it's nearly impossible to have a decent conversation because it goes sideways, or it's the other individual doesn't understand your point of view. So the whole goal here is that if we can get out of our own subjective experiences and our own subjective stories, which still are important, and see if we can't find some way to integrate those with objective information, accurate facts, it changes sort of the conversation. It's going to get us much closer to pursuing justice, which is what this course is about. So that's what I got to say about this. But I want to spend some time, because the last class was at least able to give me feedback. What do you think? Like, why is it so difficult in our culture to have these conversations? And what would be some ways to be able to have these conversations? You tell me. What do you think? How does social media play into this?
I personally think that because so
Wait, Danielle, you have muted yourself. You have to go back.
uh,
Yeah, now good. Now good.
so I was saying that like because social media is such a huge thing, and the fact that everyone's just trying to give their opinions and what they think is right or wrong, the fact that someone else is trying to undermine them and say that they're wrong and that give their opinions, they don't necessarily want to hear it. And I feel like if it's not face to face, you can't have a decent, like a true decent conversation, because you're just going to be cutting off each other and just insulting each other because you have less of a fear of being confronted in person than in over a screen rather than in person. So I feel like with hashtags, it kind of voices your opinions to a wider audience rather than that just one person, in a sense where you can gain support from others who actually think that you're right. At the same time, you run the risk of also encountering others who are wrong,
Yeah,
who disagree with you.
yeah, I think that's a good point. Um, and there's not going to be a lot of intellectual and emotional growth there. But nonetheless, what else? This is going to be, our future. I mean, in the next 20 to 30 years, you wonder how some of this, how some of this will change. The reality is that the reason why people use hashtag justice is because it works. Think of what, when we were little, it would be one thing for us to be 10-year-olds to try to make a reasoned argument why our parents should take us to, the Wawa to get a slushie. It's another thing to stomp your feet and cry until they just give up because they don't want to deal with you. So if the child does that and it works, they're going to continue doing it. The parent's going to really be up against the wall because every time their child stamps their feet, they're just going to give in. But we do that even as a culture. We have, groups that have become very effective with this, and people cave to the group because it's just easier than entering in a conversation with them. But they only do it because it works. So that's part of our problem. We've created our own issues per se, but we have to find a way to get out of it. Why do you think that we can't? What's changed? I mean, has something changed in the last 10 to 20 years that doesn't allow us to interact with people that we disagree with as much? What do you think? There's been a lot of evidence out about this, but I'm curious what you think. You guys are quiet. There's lower enrollment, all that lower attendance at church services. If anybody here is involved, our parents are involved in civic organizations, the Rotary, the Lions Club, you name it, they really struggle for membership. A lot of other social clubs and such struggle for, I mean, the end I grew up in, there was a different club for every nationality. They struggled. We're busy. We're not used to being in a situation like if you went to, okay, when you guys get older, you'll have kids, your kids will play softball or soccer, and you're going to go and you're going to sit, watching these games. You're going to be next to people that disagree with you. But your goal is not going to be to iron it out. You're just going to talk. We've lost the ability to, we don't have a lot of proximity opportunities to be alongside those people we disagree with. Social media doesn't always really allow that, right? So we post things that we perhaps are passionate about. The minute somebody's going to attack something that we've posted, they've attacked us. I mean, that's how we interpret that, right? So what do you think? There's got to be some way around all this. I mean, I can't imagine there's none of us that don't want to see an increase in peace in our lives. We just don't know how to get there.
I also think what plays a huge role in this is the way the media portrays and like how much bias they have. So usually people usually um watch what they align themselves with. So for example, a lot of like conservative people watch Fox News, there was this other, I think it's AOC, AC, something along those lines, another conservative outlet. But liberals are more likely to watch CNN and other like liberal outlets. So because those outlets are saying this is wrong, these are the enemies, it kind of paints a picture in a person's mind of kind of prejudging before actually meeting these people and actually having an actual conversation. And they only associate themselves with people they agree with instead of expanding their horizon and learning from others. So that kind of decreased our chances of actually learning how to have a conversation and learning from one another and seeing their perspective on sides and not thinking that ours is the only right one.
Yeah, it's well put. Well, that's the closing narratives, right? That's the echo chamber that people enter into because they want to stay within their own subjective, emotional, bubbles per se, which is, why I know I've probably said it 10 times. It's not really advantageous to watch the news because you're going to have, I mean, I understand that you want to get some level of what's happening out there, right? You also want to be very careful that you're simply not under the assumption that you're being informed because you're not being informed. You're being fed very particular things that they are already going to think fits their advertising, which is what it all comes down to, their advertising criteria. So whatever they're selling, who are they selling it to? And then this particular individual, these individuals that fit within this group, are going to buy these products. So we have to cater to those people. So let's only say what they're going to want to hear. That's part of our problems. That's a little new. By the way, if you go to if you look up news bias and look at the programs like MSNBC, and I'm not trying to step on some toes, they tend to be the worst, but they're not that much better than Fox. They're not that much worse than Fox. And Fox is about the same as CNN. And I mean, if you just look on the chart, you're going to start to think, what in God's name do I do? Well, the two, if you do want news and you want some quasi information, you're going to see Reuters and the and Associated Press. But that's not really interesting to read. So every morning I get a feed from Reuters and Associated Press, and I read the headlines. But there's nothing there that's outlandish. There's nothing there that's going to appeal to a particular tribe. It's just as raw data as you could possibly get. But that's part of our problem. I have one other thing to say, but what else? Anybody else have something? That was good. Thank you, Daniela.
I also think that it's kind of like a pride thing, where people like they don't want to back down from what they believe in, even if they don't have all of the all the facts right. I also think that like it's a matter of fear too sometimes because people are so used to like what they've been around and like what they've been brought up to believe. So maybe like they have like almost like a sense of fear to kind of like think outside of the box and like kind of like go against like what they believe in.
No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing worse than to think you have to reorient your position, you know. But, that's what education is supposed to do. But I think you're right. That's a problem, That's a very good point. Anybody else? Because I do have something, but I want to hear you. Okay, so we're in a debate right now in our country about how do we get people back to work, right? How do we weigh that against um, worry about spreading a virus and such? And it's very interesting to read through the various, social media postings that people have on this. Where do you get good information? There's a lot, so I have one friend and she's up in New York. We go back and forth. It's on social media, but she messages me stuff. You know, nobody really, when you were trying to figure out exactly like how many cases of COVID-19 do people have and how many people are dying from that, you saw a lot of statistics go out there. I disregard all of it. I mean, I'm not saying this from any parts and point of view. There's no way you're going to come up with a good statistic there. So what we just had a guidelines from, I guess it's from the CDC, just came out in the last couple of days on what qualifies as a COVID-19 case. Did the person have to have some of, was that a complicating factor? Did they die solely from that? What other went on? Was it related to that case? So is it only when people die from it, or can they die from when obviously the underlying conditions are related to that? All that becomes very important. But those things were never ironed out. Plus, we don't know how many people had it and had or asymptomatic. I don't know we'll ever know that. So the reality is that if we don't know how many people had it overall, and if we don't know how many people are actually died because we're not comparing apples with oranges, then any statistic that says this is the survival rate or this is the infection rate is absolutely meaningless. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for those things. What it means is we should never use those things as criteria for making decisions. Because if the CDC just came out with guidelines, it doesn't mean people are following it. So if you see a lot of numbers coming through from hospitals, that they're all changing their numbers on how many died, you're going to see people on both sides of the fence now calling foul, saying, see, I told you. Look, now they're changing all their numbers. This is good, though. See, they are changing the numbers, but they're trying to correct something so we can use one standard. If you want a definition for an injustice, it's two standards applied to the same condition. If we want to know exactly what's going on, we need one standard. A person who has died from COVID-19 fits this standard. Whatever that is, we need to use one standard. And then, even then, we're going to have to wait until we have more wide testing to find out how many people were actually sick. So, again, if I said this once before, if the Spanish flu, swept through here back in 1918, we'd have to watch what parallels we can make with some we could make. If SARS went through here in 2003, and if we still are not clear on what happened with SARS and who was responsible and what the extent of it was, and if we haven't figured that out in the last 20 years, in the middle of this, we need to really be humble. But what happens, though, is that doesn't really fit a political position very well, right? Because if you're a Democrat, you want to make sure that you're showing Trump's inadequacies. If you're a Republican, you want to make sure that you're showing Trump's successes. This is all this thing's about. And I don't mean that from just a level of cynicism. What I mean is, it's like you said, Emma, those are people that are fearful. The last thing a Republican wants to do is admit that Trump made an error. The last thing a Democrat wants to do is admit that Trump did pretty good. So they are going to fight their best to make sure that whatever narratives they put out there fit those two positions. And here we go. I mean, so we're back to our tribal. Anything else? Okay, folks. I'll hang around if anybody needs to chat. Other than that, have yourselves a very good couple days, and I will